On an ordinary winter morning, the police department of a small town received two alarming calls. Officers headed to the address where they were met with a shocking scene. What happened turns into the plot of a detective thriller, and it took a full 7 years to solve this case. Only after all this time, the truth come to light, though not everyone was prepared for the outcome. Connie Doby was born on July 31, 1976, in a small American town called Ellington, Connecticut. Her parents also had 2 daughters and a son. From an early age, the girl was known for her kindness and her desire to help people, which earned her many friends. Later, because of these qualities, Connie decided to pursue a medical education. She graduated from the University of Connecticut and then started working in sales at a pharmaceutical company. Additionally, Connie became the vice president of a local charity organization in her town that provided emergency medical assistance to people free of charge. In the early 2000s, Connie had the opportunity to create a big and happy family. She met a man named Richard, and a romance blossomed between them. The couple married on July 4, 2003. A few years later, they had a son, and 3 years after that, a second boy was born. Around the same time, Connie and Richard decided to buy a new home. They purchased a large house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington and moved in. The area was an ideal choice for a big family. Not only was the house spacious, but their sons could also play in the large backyard. Additionally, Richard and Connie's close friends lived in the same neighborhood, and they often spent time together with their families. For many years, they lived a model life. But on December 23, 2015, everything changed. That morning, the police department received 2 alarming calls. First, they were contacted by a security company who reported that an alarm had been triggered at Richard and Connie's home. 5 minutes later, Richard himself called the police and requested help. Officers immediately headed to the house where they were met with a horrifying scene. One of them entered through the open front door and immediately noticed a trail of blood leading toward the kitchen and down the stairs to the basement. The police followed the trail to the kitchen, where they found Richard. The man was partially tied to an overturned chair with zip ties, lying face down on the floor. He had several wounds on his body, and there was another plastic zip tie around his neck. The officer called out to him, and Richard responded, saying he was still inside the house. The police quickly called for backup and began searching both the house and the surrounding area. Just after this, they made another scary discovery. When going to the basement, they found Connie's body with a gun lying nearby. Meanwhile, detectives freed Richard, and while waiting for paramedics, the man explained what had happened that morning. Around 8:10 a.m., he had taken his sons to the bus stop for school before returning home. He changed into his office clothes, got in his car, and left for work. Meanwhile, Connie had been preparing for a sports activity at a local charities gym. Shortly after Richard left, he received an alert from the security service about the alarm going off in his house. This wasn't the first time it had happened. Usually, it was triggered by their cat when left alone at home. Richard also realized that he had forgotten to take his work laptop, so he decided to return home before heading to his office. Before turning around, he texted his boss to inform him that he would be delayed and then drove back. Richard arrived home between 7:45 and 8 a.m. Upon entering, he heard some noise upstairs. He went upstairs, entered Connie's bedroom, and to his horror, he saw an unknown man rummaging through their closet. The man was dressed in camouflage and his face was covered. As soon as the intruder saw Richard, he attacked him, knocking him to the floor. The unknown man then demanded Richard's wallet, bank cards, and PIN codes, threatening to wait until the family returned home and then kill them all. Shortly after this, Richard heard the garage door opening. Apparently, Connie had returned from her workout earlier than expected. Richard screamed that someone was in the house and told her to run. The intruder headed downstairs, but Richard tried to stop him. During the struggle, the unknown man managed to push Richard down the stairs and he fell to the first floor. While he was regaining his bearings, Connie ran to the basement where they kept two guns and the intruder followed her. After a few moments, Richard managed to get back on his feet and headed to the basement as well. However, when he arrived, the unknown man was already holding a gun, and in the next second, he shot Connie. The sound of the gunshot was so loud that Richard nearly went deaf for a few minutes. He thought he heard a second shot shortly afterward, but he wasn't sure. Afterward, the intruder forced Richard to sit at a table and bound his wrists and ankles with plastic zip ties. He then put the gun down, took some bolt cutters that were lying in the basement, and began to stab Richard with them. After a few blows, the intruder knocked over some objects, grabbed a gas torch, and began burning them, presumably in an attempt to destroy evidence. He then turned to Richard and pointed the torch at him. Because Richard was partially tied to the chair, he managed to stand up and knock the torch out of the intruder's hands. He then grabbed the torch and aimed it at him, partially melting the intruder's mask. The intruder, now unarmed, quickly ran to the basement, and Richard went upstairs to call the police. While Richard explained the events to the officers, they searched the house and the surrounding area for several kilometers but failed to locate the suspect. The only thing they found was Richard's wallet lying on the lawn in front of the house. The investigators then brought in sniffer dogs to try and track the killer. They let the dogs sniff Richard's wallet since the intruder had handled it for some time. However, the dogs led them right back to Richard. When they brought the dogs to the house to try and detect the intruder's scent, they also found nothing. The dogs were trained to detect traces of human presence even after several days, but none of the three dogs could pick up any scent. Another strange issue was the timeline of the events. According to Richard, it was about 5 minutes between the moment he entered the house and when the intruder left. Richard had returned home sometime between 8:40 and 9 a.m., and by all accounts, everything should have been over by around 9:05. However, the security company didn't report the alarm going off until 10:16 a.m., and Richard himself only called the police a few minutes after that. This meant that he had spent over an hour in the house before reaching out to the authorities. Additionally, the time between Connie leaving for her workout and returning home was suspiciously short. Meanwhile, Richard was taken to the hospital where doctors confirmed that his injuries were not life-threatening. Detectives took the opportunity to question him again, hoping to gather more details. Richard initially said he heard a noise upstairs as soon as he entered the house, but later changed his statement, claiming there had been no noise, and that he only saw the intruder when he went upstairs. He also claimed that the intruder didn't push him down the stairs, but that he tripped and fell himself. The main inconsistency, however, was regarding the murder. Richard initially said that after running to the basement, he saw the intruder take a gun from Connie and shoot her, but earlier he had stated that he didn't know how the suspect had obtained the weapon. Furthermore, Richard mentioned that it was pitch dark in the basement, which made detectives wonder how he could have seen what was happening. Richard also said that he didn't see Connie's body because of the darkness, so he wasn't sure if she was dead. Another puzzling detail was the nature of Richard's injuries. The cuts from the bolt cutters appeared superficial and didn't pose a serious threat, but most of the cuts were on the left side of his torso, even though Richard was right-handed. His right arm was free from the ties, so it would have been possible for him to have inflicted those wounds on himself. Additionally, there were no bruises or scratches on his body despite his claim that he had struggled with the intruder and fallen down the stairs. While there were bloodstains on Richard's shorts, forensic experts found inconsistencies in his story. If Richard had been injured with a sharp object while sitting in the chair, there should have been at least some blood on the lower part of his shorts, but none was found. Similarly, the area in the basement where the intruder allegedly attacked him with the bolt cutters had only a few tiny blood droplets on the floor, despite the fact that the chair should have left a lot of blood on the ground. Also, after the intruder left, Richard claimed he spent some time recovering before crawling upstairs to the first floor. However, there were no blood traces on the stairs. even though Richard had been bleeding from his injuries. One final strange detail that caught the detective's attention was the open basement window. The police considered the possibility that the intruder had entered through the window, but they discovered something odd. The window locks had been undone from the inside. They conducted an experiment and were able to open the window only after one of the officers broke the glass. This raised doubts about whether the intruder could have opened the window without breaking it. All of this led investigators to suspect that Richard's story might have been fabricated. They returned to the hospital to ask if there had been any problems in his marriage, and Richard admitted that he had a mistress. According to his account, he and Connie had been trying to have a third child, but Connie couldn't get pregnant. So Richard proposed surrogacy, and they chose his former classmate as the surrogate. She had recently divorced and wanted to have a child. Richard and Connie planned for her to carry the baby, and afterward the three of them would raise it together. Richard claimed that he and his mistress had conceived naturally after the surrogacy plan failed due to the high cost of medical procedures. He said that he was fully supportive of the situation. However, detectives found this story highly impossible and continued to question Richard. His story quickly changed once again. He now claimed that Connie had never met his mistress and that she didn't even know about the pregnancy. After further questioning by the police, Richard admitted that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years, and Connie had no idea about it. Detectives contacted this woman, who confirmed that she had entered into a romantic relationship with Richard less than a year before the incident. She knew he was married, but Richard had told her he was going through a divorce. The woman became pregnant in June, 6 months before the crime. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer to begin the divorce process and planned to finalize it before the baby was born. However, investigators discovered that Richard had never actually hired a lawyer. Moreover, all of Connie's friends said she had never mentioned a divorce, which led detectives to suspect that Connie herself had been trying to end the marriage but had no knowledge of her husband's secret life. Further investigation into the financial situation revealed more suspicious details. Friends and family informed the detectives that Connie had often complained about a contractor with whom they had disagreements regarding work done on their house. The contractor was aggressive, and Connie admitted that she was genuinely afraid of him. As a result of these issues, she and Richard bought 2 guns and installed a security system. Investigators looked into this contractor but found that he had an alibi at the time of the murder. Ultimately, they returned their focus to Richard, the only remaining suspect. For months, the police kept their suspicions about Richard being the potential killer confidential, and most of Connie's friends and relatives believed the crime was committed by an unknown burglar. Detectives spent considerable time talking to Connie's closest friends, all of whom stated that Connie would definitely have confided in them if she had known about Richard's infidelity, especially if the mistress was pregnant. Other acquaintances noted that Richard had acted strangely after his wife's death. He didn't seem upset or grief-stricken. A few days after Connie's murder, he even asked several neighbors where they usually ordered food from. The police also uncovered that Richard and Connie were facing serious financial problems. While Connie had no idea where their money was going, Richard had been secretly spending it on his mistress. They found a note on her phone titled "Why I Want a Divorce," where she listed reasons such as Richard constantly lying, mistreating her and their children, and taking money without asking. From this, investigators concluded that Connie had been considering ending the marriage, but she had no idea about her husband's secret life. When police looked into the financials more closely, they discovered that just 5 days after Connie's murder, Richard attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's life insurance account. The security service blocked the transaction. A month later, he received a check for $75,000 from his wife's employer. This raised suspicions that Richard may have had financial motives for murder. Another strange detail was that Richard canceled the security service contract just 19 days after the murder. If his story about a burglar was true, this would have been an incredibly illogical move, putting not just himself but also his two sons at risk. Desperate to find more evidence, the detectives obtained a warrant to search all the electronic devices in the house. This led to a breakthrough. Using the data they gathered, they were able to reconstruct a precise timeline of the events that morning. At 8:44 a.m., the security system recorded the garage door opening and closing. Detectives determined this was when Connie left for her workout, as she appeared on surveillance cameras near the gym at 8:53 a.m. At 8:50 a.m., Richard, still at home, initially disabled the security system, only to re-enable it shortly after. He was supposed to leave for work at this time. At 8:59 a.m., Richard disabled the security system again with his remote control. Considering that the system works only within a short range, Richard must have returned home, which matched his claim of coming back to pick up a laptop. However, there was a problem. Richard had stated he received an alert about the alarm going off on his way to work. But the security system showed no alerts during this period. This meant he didn't receive any notifications. At 9:02 a.m., Richard accessed his email from his tablet and 2 minutes later wrote to his boss explaining that he was delayed because of an alarm. But this was another inconsistency. Not only was there no alert, but the email was sent while Richard was at home, as his tablet was connected to his home Wi-Fi. This meant that Richard had been home for at least 4 minutes before he supposedly discovered the intruder. All of this took place in less than a minute, which was physically impossible. The most crucial piece of evidence came from Connie's fitness tracker. She arrived at the gym at 8:53 a.m. but left shortly after as the workout was canceled. At 9:08 a.m., the tracker stopped counting steps. Based on this, detectives concluded that Connie drove home and arrived by 9:18 a.m., taking 8 minutes to get back. Richard had claimed that the intruder attacked her as soon as she entered the house, but the data from the tracker disproved this. Connie walked 370 meters inside her home between 9:18 a.m. and 10:17 a.m., and her social media activity showed she was online for about 6 minutes during this period. This meant that Connie was alive for almost an hour after entering the house, directly contradicting Richard's version of events. The police had not just theoretical discrepancies but solid digital evidence. The detectives had spent over a year compiling this detailed information, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For most of his friends, this was a complete shock. They had no idea what evidence the police had gathered, and still believed Richard was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Richard was charged with murder. Initially, the bail was set at $5 million, but his lawyer argued that Richard had no criminal history and had 2 minor children to care for. The amount was reduced to $1 million, which Richard paid while awaiting trial. The trial lasted 5 years with many delays and finally began in April 2022. During this time, Richard's defense team presented numerous interesting facts, including 6 DNA samples from unknown individuals found in the house. They also pointed out that only small traces of gunpowder were found on Richard's hands, arguing that if he had fired the shot, there would have been much more residue. However, the prosecution refuted these arguments, stating that the gunpowder residue was collected hours after Richard was taken to the hospital, and he could have easily wiped off most of the evidence in the interim. As for the DNA samples, there was no indication that they belonged to the mysterious assailant. They could have been left by anyone visiting the house. On the other hand, the prosecution presented a detailed digital map of the couple's movements that morning, which disproved Richard's version of events. The evidence suggested that Connie had been alive for nearly an hour after the alleged shooting and had moved around the house and used social media. The most powerful evidence was Richard's inconsistent testimony, as he had changed his story multiple times. All the contradictions were used by the prosecution to demonstrate the falsehood of his statement. The trial lasted 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, the jury found Richard guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison, though he maintained his innocence. The trial was a significant weight for Connie's family, as they only learned about all the evidence against Richard during the proceedings. Until then, many had believed his story of a mysterious burglar. After everything came to light, there was no longer any doubt about Richard's guilt. Richard's defense team indicated they would appeal the verdict, but so far these efforts have not got any results. As for Connie's children, they were taken in by relatives. At the time of the murder, the boys were 6 and 9 years old. They lived with their father until the conviction was handed down. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.